Hello, I'm Peter Moore, and welcome to Travels Through Time, the podcast made in partnership with Colourgraph. Hello, I'm Peter Moore. Today we're travelling back a century to an English village, a disturbing mystery, and to the age of Sherlock Holmes. Today people remember that infamous French miscarriage of justice, the Dreyfus affair, but the English equivalent, the case of George Edalji, is not so well known. The stories, though, do have much in common. They share an establishment cover-up, a racial prejudice, a compelling plotline, and a vivid historical context. In the Edalji case, we can add the tantalising fact that the mystery involved Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who launched an heroic investigation into the crime in just the manner of his fictional detective Sherlock Holmes. A little more than a century after the events, the story was poignantly fictionalised in Julian Barnes's novel Arthur and George. Now the author, Shrabani Basu, has returned to the case with an historian's eye. Shrabani Basu is a journalist and Sunday Times best-selling author. Her books include, of course, Victoria and Abdul, a true story of the Queen's closest confidant, which was adapted for the big screen. Her latest book is at the centre of this episode. It's called The Mystery of the Parsee Lawyer, Arthur Conan Doyle, George Edalji, and the Case of the Foreigner in the English Village. We have a newly released hardback copy of this book to give away to a lucky listener. To enter the draw, all you have to do is like our Facebook page. All details are in the show notes. Otherwise, enjoy. Shrabani Basu, welcome to Travels Through Time. I do have to, before we get going, I'm going to declare an interest. I think this is the best way to say it. I grew up in Staffordshire, on a farm, well, or behind a farm, you might say. And as a young lad, I used to go to all of the places which we're going to be talking about over the course of the next hour, including this little village of Great Wyrley, where I think I played cricket once or twice.
Wow, that is fascinating.
I thought a nice place to start was with two different quotes. They are both by Arthur Conan Doyle, and one is written in his own voice, and this first is written in the voice of Sherlock Holmes. So this is Sherlock Holmes talking in The Adventure of the Copper Beeches. He says, "It is my belief, Watson, founded upon my experience, that the lowest and vilest alleys of London do not present a more dreadful record of sin than does the smiling and beautiful countryside." Okay, and the second, so this is a letter that Conan Doyle wrote in January 1907 to the Daily Telegraph. And he writes, "I've been engaged for some time past in investigating the case of Mr. George Edalji, a young solicitor of Parsee origin who was condemned at the Stafford Quarter Sessions of October 1903 to 7 years penal servitude for the maiming of cattle. I should be much obliged to you if you would aid the cause of justice by publishing the results of my inquiry in an early number of the Daily Telegraph. You would add to the favour if you would permit the statement to be headed 'No copyright,' for I hope that in that case other papers, and especially Midland papers, would copy it in extensor. Only an appeal to the public can put an end to a course of injustice and persecution which amount, as I hope that I shall show, to a national scandal." Can you tell me what he was talking about, please?
Well, this is the whole, as I call it, the mystery of the Parsee lawyer. So this is an incident that happens in 1903 in this village of Great Wyrley. And suddenly terror grips this mining village. somebody is coming at night and slashing horses and cows and just leaving them to die in the fields. It's an absolutely gruesome crime. And the police have no handle on this. This goes on for months, 6 months. It starts in February 1903 and it's been going on. The villagers are in a panic. The police have drafted in extra forces, but they can't do anything. And so, of course, the rumors and the counter rumors all start flying. Everyone is trying to solve this mystery, find what they call the Wyrley Ripper. And suspicion falls, of course, on this in the only Indian family in the village. And this is the family of George Edalji. His father is the vicar of Great Wyrley. His name is Shapurji Edalji. He arrived from Bombay. He's a convert to Christianity, and he's become the vicar of this white parish. And he is married to a white English woman, Charlotte. He has 3 children. The eldest is George Edalji, who is the main character in this story. And as these horses are being killed, suddenly there is a spate of anonymous letters. So anonymous letters go to the police, they go to George Edalji, and they go to other villagers. And somehow they are all pointing to George as the leader of a gang that is doing this. The police round up and they just arrest George. He's tried and he's imprisoned. He's, found guilty and imprisoned for 7 years, but he's let out on parole after 3 years. But the crime still hangs on his head. And so he doesn't know what to do. He can't practice as a solicitor. So which is what he used to do. He was a 28-year-old solicitor who did nothing, led a very boring life, went from the vicarage to his office in Birmingham, didn't have too many friends, didn't do anything much. And suddenly he's arrested, he's let out, but he can't practice. And he decides to write to Arthur Conan Doyle. And he says that the only person who can help him solve this crime, the person who can clear his name, is the man who created Sherlock Holmes. So it needs Sherlock Holmes to solve this mystery. And he writes to Arthur Conan Doyle.
It's sometimes remembered, I don't know if this is absolutely accurate, you'll tell me in a moment, but is this because, of course, during the great years of Sherlock Holmes in the early 1900s, there was a tradition that people would write to Sherlock Holmes believing him to be a real character, and Conan Doyle would be snowballed with fan mail. But the idea that he only really took up one case, and that was this one, I'm not sure if that's accurate, but
that is true.
Is that right?
Yes, it is. So he would get lots of letters for everything. In fact, everything to him, his own mail used to be marked to Sherlock Holmes, which made Arthur Conan Doyle really fed up of the character he had created. In fact, when a shirt load, from the laundry came marked to Sherlock Holmes, he said, "This is it. I'm going to kill off Holmes," which he does. He kills him in one of his stories, and he says that's the end of him, throws him off the Reichenbach Falls. But you can't kill Holmes. He has such a following. So he has to bring him back. And he brings him back at the same time that all this is happening in Great Wyrley. So Hound of Baskerville is published in 1902. That's the time things are going wrong for George Edalji. And by 1903, it's out. He's in prison, of course. And that's where he reads The Hound of the Baskerville. And he's fascinated. He's never really read Arthur Conan Doyle before. And so this introduction in prison to this master writer then leads him down another path.
But this is a crime with very long roots, which stretch back into the 1880s, 1890s. You would maybe make an argument even earlier to the 1870s. Really, there's been a nasty, vindictive campaign of harassment against the Edalji family for a long time in Great Wyrley. Do you want to talk a little bit about that to set that contextual scene?
Yep, absolutely. So in 1876, Shapurji Edalji becomes the vicar of Great Wyrley. And you can imagine there is this brown man with a pronounced Indian accent. He is the first vicar of South Asian origin in UK. And this brown man is out here to preach to a white parish. He's here with his wife, his English wife. And in 1876, George is born. So the same year, George is born, and then 2 more children follow. So the village are watching him. They see the children being baptized. The family more or less keeps to themselves. But the trouble starts in 1888, when George is just 12 years old, because one day Shapuji finds that there is graffiti outside his house painted. The Edaljis are wicked. And also he receives this ad, a letter saying subscribe to the Express and Star. He doesn't think much of that, and he thinks, a salesman has put this through. But then this same letter, subscribe or I'm going to shoot you in the head, starts coming. And he realizes this is pretty grim. And slowly there is suddenly a lot of hate mail pouring through the vicarage and hoaxes. And this goes on. So, first the police suspect that it's the maid who works in their house. She's arrested, but then she's let go because she's quite young. She's just about 17. And somehow the police at this time keep thinking that it is George. George was only 12 when the letter started, but they keep thinking it's this boy who's done it. He's written these letters because many of them were written in a sort of childish hand. And they think that this is this boy. He's he's got bulging eyes because he was very myopic. So they find him an odd-looking boy, dark-skinned, odd-looking boy, and they think he's the one writing letters to himself. Now, why, it completely defies logic. Why would he harass his father? Because then there are hoaxes. Delivery men start appearing at the vicarage saying, you ordered all this cement, and they would upload it. And the poor vicar would say, no, I didn't. Then, builders would arrive. You've got a roof to mend. Or worse, they would, call out for doctors. Mrs. Edalji is very ill, and doctors would come rushing and find Mrs. Edalji fine. Nothing had happened to her. So it was very embarrassing for the vicar. And he actually puts out, he goes to the local press and he puts out a newspaper, an article saying, anybody sending me things, please, check whether I've ordered them because somebody's playing tricks on me. And so it's all very puzzling, but it goes on. From 1888, this goes on. By 1892, between 1892 and 1895, this is still Victorian Britain, and George is now 17 years old. This spate of letters becomes more violent. They are now abusive. They now say, we're going to kill George. And, I've seen these letters in the archives and, just think, these letters being directed at you, your wife, your son, who is barely a teenager, and saying he's going to be in his grave, And there is this Sergeant Upton, and he's convinced that it is George. He reports to his chief, who plays a prominent part in this whole thing, is Chief Constable of Staffordshire Police, and his name is Captain Anson. He writes to him and he says, I'm sure it's George, it's this boy, and when it's proved, he should be punished. So even before an animal has been slashed and all these crimes happen, there is a background of tension, race hate in this village.
I think looking at the letters, they're very disturbing. The content of them is so unsettling that you wonder how they continued living. But because, of course, this was the age of Galton and eugenics, it's a generation after Darwin. But at the same time, some quite interesting things are happening within society, and you write about this. So, for example, we had the first 3 South Asian MPs in the 1890s, which was a surprising fact to me that they were all Parsees. And just around the corner from me, actually, there's a blue plaque on one of the buildings, and it says Gandhi was a law student here in the 1890s. So we know there's a long history of Britain being a multiracial country and society, but it seems that in the 1890s, there's a sense of people who are from different places coming into positions of power. And it's a very strange place, Great Wyrley, to find a parson who is a Parsee. It's just, it is bizarre in a way, isn't it? So could you talk a little about that?
Yep. And so in 1892, the first Indian MP in the House of Commons is a Parsee, Dadabhai Nauroji. Now, of course, he had contested earlier. And at that time, the then Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, had declared that, oh, England is not ready to vote in a black man yet. And this black man speech, in today's terms, we would say it went viral. But this is what happened. There were sort of cartoon depictions of Salisbury saying Britain is not ready for a black man. And then when he wins in 1892, a few years later, these cartoons come up again, and Punch portrays, Dadabhai Naoroji in his long Parsi robes. Yes, so there is a Parsi, first time elected in Parliament. But it is interesting. I found it really interesting that Shapurji never appealed to him. And I couldn't figure out why this happened, because, you'd think you'd write to an MP if he was there, and especially you're a Parsi. But what had happened is Shapurji was a convert, he was a Christian, and he had left behind his Parsi faith. So I feel he didn't want to go back and ask the Parsis for help, because he saw them as people he had left behind when he left India. He had left his family, he'd left his faith, and he'd converted to Christianity.
Could you explain what a Parsee is, just for clarity?
It's only the Indian Zoroastrians who are called Parsis. They were called Parsis because they'd come from Persia, and they settled in Bombay, they settled in Karachi. They were very enterprising. So you see them in business. They profited from the opium trade. They were also very westernized. And so this was a community that the missionaries were targeting. And of course, Parsis are known to worship the sun. They're sun worshippers. So so they worship nature, which is such a beautiful thing. But, when it's twisted like that, this is what he is doing. This is why he goes out in the dark. The poor man just goes for a walk, but it becomes translated into prowling in the dark. So, a little fact just sort of flies away in these rumors.
So we'd best get into it. And I'm going to ask you now, I will give you the opportunity, I should say, of a little bit of time travel. So we always say to people who come on this podcast, if you could pick just 1 year in the past, which year would you like to go back to? So in this story, which year have you picked?
I'm going to go with 1907, because that's when Arthur Conan Doyle comes into the picture.
Right. Well, early 20th century. Do you want to just give us a very quick flavour of, I mean, you've written about this period before when you wrote about Victoria and Abdul, and so this time. Could you, before we get into the detail, 1907, what's going on in Britain? What are the kind of big themes and obsessions?
Well, it's the Edwardian era. The whole Victorian era is over. She died in 1901, ended that period. That was the height of empire. That was when Britain ruled the seas, ruled everything. But since then, we had a little downfall. We had the Boer Wars, which were a victory, but they were hard fought, and they had to be justified, and they were not popular. And now Edward has come on the throne, and we have the trains. We still have the old-fashioned trams, but things are changing. So the industrial era is progressing further, but also the racism in the society is also increasing. We see this as soon as Victoria. I mean, I'm going to go back to my old book, Victoria and Abdul, because when Victoria dies in 1901, she was very close to this man, Abdul Karim, who served in her court. And the first thing that her successor, heir and successor, Bertie, who becomes Edward VII, does is to burn all the letters Victoria wrote to Abdul. So a bonfire is made, and he just wants to erase Abdul from history. So he comes down heavily on Abdul. He comes down heavily on all the Indians that are employed in this royal palace, because Victoria loved them. There's unrest in other parts of the empire. So there's a sort of churn as we enter, the beginning of the 20th century. And this is exactly where trouble starts in George's life.
Brilliant setup. Where are we going to go for your first scene then? Where would you like to go?
So 1907, I'm going to start with Arthur Conan Doyle. He has accepted, George has written to him, as we've said before, he's written to him to take up this case, and he's accepted, he's met George, but now he's got to, he's put on his Sherlock Holmes hat, and he's got to investigate this. So he needs to go to the scene of crime. So early morning, he catches the train from London, and he goes to Great Wyrley. He changes trains in Birmingham, catches the branch line, gets off at Great Wyrley, and walks to the vicarage, where he is met by Shapurji and his wife and their daughter Maud. He joins them for breakfast, and as he sits at the table, he writes later that it was this family that really convinced him that, George was innocent, because here was this careworn vicar, really anxious and tired. And there is this, his wife, Charlotte, with her gray, he describes with her gray hair and her blue eyes, and also very troubled. And this young daughter, Maud, who should have been supported by the police, by this, by the authorities, but instead targeted by them, targeted by bullies, as he writes. And he listens to their story. He hears about all the things that have happened in the past, all the letters. So Arthur Conan Doyle now wants to walk to the field. So he crosses this line, he climbs up the tracks, he crosses the tracks, he climbs over gorse bushes, crosses the fields. And again, he realizes that George, with his myopia, would never have been able to cross this path on a wild and stormy night. He feels the soil and he says, this is sandy soil, but what they found on George's shoe was clay soil. So he's got all these, little notes that he's made. And then, of course, he has to go to the village itself. So he goes and he talks to the locals, he talks to the villagers, he talks to a grocer who had received hate mail himself. And he talks to another person called William Greatorex, who had also received mails and who had also, letters were sent in the name of his son, Wilfred Greatorex. So he's sort of putting or connecting the dots and saying, what would George have to do with these people? Why were letters sent to them? Why was George named in letters to them? So this whole puzzle is, he's trying to get his head around this.
At the moment, at this point in 1907, Arthur Conan Doyle must be one of the most famous people in Britain. So the idea of him turning up in your village is going to cause such a flutter of excitement. And is that reflected in the source material?
Oh, absolutely. So they all talk to him. They're very flattered that, Arthur Conan Doyle has come to the village. He even writes to Anson, the chief constable I spoke about earlier, and he wants to meet him. Arthur Conan Doyle goes to visit Anson. So this is all happening on the same day. And this is his last stop. And initially, when he writes to him, talking about Sherlock Holmes, Anson is really flattered that, the great Arthur Conan Doyle has written to him. And he says he would love to hear what Sherlock Holmes would have thought of this crime. And of course, it doesn't go well for the relation between Anson and Arthur Conan Doyle. Conan Doyle quickly realizes that Anson is prejudiced. He's allowed all his prejudice to come in this picture. He goes back and he writes. He writes his articles in the Daily Telegraph in a few days. And he says that the whole investigation was handled badly. He pulls out all the faults in the trial. And he literally just picks faults with everything and puts it before his readers and says this man is innocent.
I was just going to go back to Anson. That Sherlock, well, I keep calling him Sherlock. That Conan Doyle realizes so quickly that he is prejudiced in this criminal case is revealing itself, because I think, having read Conan Doyle's fiction, you realize that he's not a man who's at the liberal end of the spectrum. He's a unionist at one point. Yes. There's a lot of stereotypes and tropes. I remember reading The Lost World, one of his, which has some kind of frankly racist descriptions today we'd describe as.
Of course. So, I mean, that is the irony of this whole thing, because...
But if Anson is beyond him to this point of obviousness, you see, it must... I suppose, well, it's an insight into that meeting between the two of them, because he knows from the moment he sees him, doesn't he?
The irony, he's doing it for empire, because, this is what we do. We good men of empire, we seek justice. Hence, he's doing this for
That's such an
George.
interesting point. So you're saying that a central tenet of civilization in the British mind at this point is the legal system and
Yeah,
the
yeah. Democracy as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I
Mhm.
think just for some nuance as well, I was interested to see, because rather than splitting this into a kind of binary and saying that the people over here were racially prejudiced, there was still a petition of 10,000 people that demanded justice for George, including
Yes.
MPs and members of the establishment. So when you're trying to
Yes.
work
Hmm.
out what their motivation is, I think it's probably fair as well to say that they have a real belief, faith in the law. British law has to be seen to be served. And
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are lawyers, members of the legal profession who signed this petition. There are doctors. There are Gujaratis. Indians.
yeah,
Gujarati is the language that Parsis speak. So there are many of them, and then they contribute to a fund for Edalji. In this case, we're talking about this village,
yeah,
and possibly, this prejudice in this village. So this is a mining village, so there's two sections of population here. So there are the working class, there are the miners, the agricultural laborers, and so it's essentially working class. Literacy rates are low, deaths are high, mining accidents, babies dying young. And on the other hand, you also have the landowners, because they own the mines, they own the farm agricultural land. And Shapurji is falling between both these categories. And he hasn't got his supporters in, of course, the landed don't like him. And well, the working class are just so busy getting on with their lives.
yeah. Well, I just love that picture of Arthur Conan Doyle browsing through the hedgerows. It's quite an interesting one. Okay, we're going to have to keep going. The next scene,
Mhm.
where would you like to go next? We'll leave Great Wyrley, wonderful name though it is, behind, and we'll go forwards.
Right. So the next scene we'll take is April 1907. And I've chosen April because it's after Arthur Conan Doyle has published his pieces in the Daily Telegraph, and they've caused a sensation. They have forced the Home Office to set up a committee. A committee is set up, and it's a three-man committee, and they published their report in April. But of course, the committee, the establishment, they stand together, and the chair of the committee is Sir Albert de Rutzen, and he is a cousin of Anson. So
Aha.
one of Conan Doyle's friends comment that the white face of Anson has to be preserved much more than the brown face of George Edalji. So, even this committee is not going to go that well. So what happens? In April, the committee publishes its report, and what do they say? They actually give George Edalji a free pardon. So victory for Arthur Conan Doyle, big victory. He is now, no longer accused of this crime. In fact, they say that there was the jury. They fault the jury, and they say the jury didn't make the correct decision. They fault the police, which makes Anson really angry. And they sort of say that yes, they criticize Staffordshire police, but there is a sting in the tail. They say that George is not going to be compensated because he was the author of the letters. So this causes, this makes Arthur Conan Doyle explode in fury. He says this is absolutely ridiculous, because either a man is guilty, and if he's guilty, he should be punished. But if he's not guilty and you give him a free pardon and you say you made a mistake, well, 3 years in prison, where's the compensation? So he demands compensation. And what about George? George says that this is, he says he's very happy that they've given him the free pardon, but this is completely unjust. He should get compensation, and he declares that I'm going to fight for compensation till I get it. I deserve my compensation. So the battle is on. And what is Conan Doyle going to do now?
Well, that's
So you.
interesting. But there's a few things I just wanted
Mhm.
to check with you, and you can maybe expand on this. Is that at this point in British history, what is the recourse to someone who's been falsely imprisoned, or if there's been a miscarriage of justice? There doesn't seem to
Mhm.
be a court of appeals at this point, so you have to
Yeah.
go to the Home
You
Secretary. Is that right?
you have to petition. That's all you can do. So there is no court. There is no legal recourse after this. Once you're guilty, you're guilty. Arthur Conan Doyle has written this piece in the Telegraph. More than the petitions, it's the piece in the Telegraph that finally makes them set up the committee. But of course, the committee then says that no compensation for George. So up till now, Arthur Conan Doyle in his articles has just taken he's discussed the case. He said his job is to prove that George isn't guilty, that George is innocent. He is not exploring who is the real killer. Now, when the Home Office don't give him compensation, he says, I'm going to now take this a step further. I have a good enough idea, and I'm going to tell them who is the killer.
Wow.
So this now the second stage of his investigation, and the real investigation actually begins. So this is where we come in. He now again writes 3 pieces in the Daily Telegraph. The Daily Telegraph has become the forum for Arthur Conan Doyle now. And he says, who wrote these letters? It's very important to find out who wrote the letters. And he publishes 3 articles. And he picks up, he says, so let's untangle this and see who and why would these letters be written. And he picks these letters, he publishes copies in the paper, so people can compare George's handwriting and the anonymous letters. And he says, the readers can see that one looks like George's handwriting is that of an adult, and this other one is like an illiterate scribble. Then he says, also, what is the motive? Why is this young schoolboy, Wilfred Greatorex, younger than George, getting these letters? Why would he be writing letters in his name? What is the connection? And then he starts investigating. I won't go too much into all the detail because it's there in the book, but he publishes all, I don't want to give the whole story away.
No, don't. Keep it.
But he goes on this trail, and then he publishes the second set of letters, which which arrived at the house in the 1880s. And he says, these letters, these were clearly written by a family, members of the same family. So he is not naming the person, but villagers are quickly working out who Arthur Conan Doyle is referring to. So when he writes his pieces in the Telegraph, he compares this case to the Dreyfus affair in France.
Yeah.
And he says that case happened to this man, Alfred Dreyfus, who was accused of selling secrets, naval secrets. And he said that he was targeted because he was a Jew, and George Edalji was targeted because he's a Parsee.
Yeah.
So he says this is this is England's Dreyfus affair.
Yeah.
And he takes on the role of Emile Zola. This is his accused.
But there's another kind of similarity, isn't there? Because again, it's the use of journalism, the newspapers, as a way of generating public support behind a popular cause, behind a cause célèbre. And he pretty much does what Zola does with that famous J'accuse. It's there in the Daily Telegraph. And I suppose Anson in this case is the villain.
Oh, totally. And then what is even more interesting is, the clash with which I talk about in the book is because I found lots of new material while I was researching, and they're the letters between Anson and Conan Doyle. And goodness, they are a treasure trove. They are hammer and tongs at each other, so much so that Anson is laying false trails to confuse and trip up Conan Doyle. He's leading him down different routes, and Conan Doyle is, and he watches as he walks down a wrong path. So it's entertaining as well as being quite shocking.
Can't imagine that's ever happened before. But anyway. Hello, it's Peter here. As ever, we like to give you some visual imagery to go along with the spoken descriptions in the episode. So today we're going to include a colorized image of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle made from a photograph taken at about the time of the Edalji case on our website. It's of course made by Jordan Lloyd of Colourgraph. It's been a really busy and very exciting time for our friends at Colourgraph recently. They've massively increased the number of colorized images that are available to purchase on their website, which is colourgraph.co. There are now literally hundreds of landscapes, cityscapes, architectural views, Americana and portraits that have been made for organisations like the National Geographic, the Times, the BBC, and the Imperial War Museum. From the D-Day beaches to the Flatiron buildings in New York City to the blossoming cherry trees in Washington, D.C. in 1925, there really is something for everyone. Until now, it's been pretty hard to purchase such compelling works of art for yourself, but Colourgraph are changing this. Their prints are high-quality visual history, expertly researched and beautifully produced. They make such unusual and delightful presents too, and we're really happy to recommend them to all of our listeners. To see what I mean, you really have to visit their site. It's colourgraph.co. Scene 3. Let's go to your third scene. And where does this lead us to?
So the third scene is, as we said, Conan Doyle is, this is September 1907, and Arthur Conan Doyle is on his honeymoon. He has married Jean Leckie. He's taking her on a European tour. But guess what is following him all along on this
Great
honeymoon?
Wyrley.
Yes, it's the George Edalji case. So because he's left instructions that all letters that come to his house must be redirected. There's the Dresden, there's a letter from there. And then it goes on from Dresden, they move to Venice, check into this beautiful hotel in Venice, luxurious former palace. I think it was called the Royal Hotel Danieli, on the canal, gorgeous views. But just when Jean is thinking, oh, yes, we are in Venice, under the Venetian stars, and this is so romantic. Oh, no, there's another letter. But this letter gets Conan Doyle so excited because it is from California. It is from Long Beach, California. What happens is, at some time while he's investigating, George Edalji gets another pile of mail, and one of them is an advertisement. It's come from California. It's an advertisement for an article that George has written. And on the side of this ad, a person has scribbled lots of, crazy things and sent it to him. So, and he's given the address as the Ark. Now, Conan Doyle, who's following this family that I talked about, and he said it's definitely this family. It's called the Sharp. They're the Sharp family of Great Wyrley. And he thinks that one of those brothers is the man who has now gone to California and is writing this mail. And he thinks he's tracked him. It took him 5 months, and he thinks he's made this breakthrough. So he is thrilled. He gets this letter. Out goes Jean's, plans for a lovely romantic dinner, because he's writing to the Home Office immediately saying, here is final proof that I have solved the case. And after 5 months, I have traced Frank Sharp, and he lives in this house, in this lodging house called the Ark in California.
There's lots of imagination in this story and lots of things to speculate. Were you in that room with the two of them as a kind of shadowy, ghosty figure in the corner? It'd be quite a fun scene to watch over this one, wouldn't it? You've got the dynamics of the honeymoon
Yes,
at long last.
yes.
But what like kind of gives a sense of Conan Doyle's personality? Was he like just an intense romantic who could get carried away with things? I mean romantic in not the kind of callow modern use of the word, but in the old-fashioned.
Oh yes, he's the old-fashioned romantic. He wanted to abandon his Sherlock Holmes books because he wanted to write historic romances. That's what he wanted to do. He did write a few, and they weren't. They weren't as popular as his Conan Doyle's. In fact, I don't think they were popular at all. And in fact, when they get married, George is invited to the wedding. So you can imagine this awkward man is standing there watching the likes of, Bram Stoker, other authors, biggest publishers, the editor of Strand, all at this reception. The champagne is flowing. And later, Arthur Conan Doyle writes that George had come to his reception, and he was proudest. He was the guest he was proudest of. So that was sweet. It just showed that, there was a real bond between them. And the older man really cared for George. Otherwise, why would, he could be just doing the case. He needn't have called him for the wedding.
Well,
that's really special.
Listen, this is kind of one of the last question, I think, of this scene that I wanted to put to you, which is, we've talked a lot about Arthur Conan Doyle, but I wanted to ask you, who do you think is the hero of this book, if we can reduce it to those terms? Because we haven't talked much about George, but there's as I was reading, you kind of side with him because he's such an awkward like lad who's caught in this situation, which, I mean, we read much more about experiences of racism today in our media, of people like kind of having kind of prejudice against them in their household, all the rest of this. But this is so long ago, and you can kind of get a sense that George is he's so attacked so unfairly, so nastily, but he just wants to live this quiet life. He keeps his head down. He goes to work on the train. He comes home. He goes for walks on his own. And I thought there was something very steadfast and actually quite like quietly heroic about him. Would you agree with that?
I do. So initially I felt really sorry for George, this awkward boy when he's young and he's facing this and thinking that he has no mates in school. He must be bullied because of the way he looks, his color, everything. And then slowly there is, as the book goes on and you see George replying, you see George taking on this case. He's not a pushover. And I do
No,
like that
he's
about
got
him, that
fibre.
he fights. He does go on fighting. He is very boring. He doesn't have a big voice. He doesn't have the drama and the style of Arthur Conan Doyle. But he's a quiet fighter. He keeps at it. Almost a plodder. But you have to say that he doesn't give up. So,
But sometimes it's those, as we look back in the long view, it's sometimes those personality traits which create history in a way, aren't they? Because he could have acted in a very different manner during this whole story,
yeah.
and it would have been a different story. It could have been, I don't know,
What would have
a very
happened if he
different.
hadn't written to Arthur Conan Doyle? What would have happened if Arthur Conan
Yeah.
Doyle hadn't accepted? But of course, Arthur Conan Doyle too is our hero in the story. I think they both are heroes together, because if he hadn't backed George and taken his case up, George would never have been allowed to practice. He would probably have left law. Goodness knows what he would have done. He couldn't return to Great Wyrley because he feared that if he went there, he went back and another, any cattle was killed, he would be targeted again. So he
Yeah.
never returned to Great Wyrley. He really lost his home. He had to live in London, which he didn't really like that much. He was used to the quiet country life. So
Yeah.
he never marries. We don't know why. Maybe this case just hung on his head so much. Who would marry him? If he wasn't somebody who was sociable, he probably never met anybody. So then he ends up, with living his last few years of his life with his sister, who looks after him. So he's
Yeah.
quite a
I
tragic
should point
figure.
out, actually,
Yeah.
I just want to point out at the moment that people who are familiar already with this story probably will be so through Julian Barnes' book Arthur and George, which is a fictional telling of this, although very like faithful to the facts as well. And I just wanted to make the point that you of course write about this early on, and the fact that you have found quite a lot of supplementary new material, which is very exciting, which allows you to turn a novel into a fully fleshed out non-fiction book, fully kind of living history, which is I don't know if you want to say something quickly about that.
Yep, I wanted to write about George ages ago, years ago, even before I wrote Victor and Abdul. But then when Julian Barnes wrote the book, I said, well, it's been done by this famous novelist. What am I going to do? So I left it. I sort of parked that idea. And it was in 2015 that I discovered that some material, some letters were going to be auctioned. And they were letters between Conan Doyle and Anson. And that really triggered me. I said, it's a sign. There's got to be new material there. I've got to follow this and find out. And so that's what started me. So in 2015, I followed those letters. They were auctioned. And I said, oh my God, don't let them go to a private, somebody's hands in private. And I never see them again. But they were bought by Portsmouth Council. Portsmouth Library has them. And I could make an appointment to go see all the boxes. And that's where the story of Conan Doyle versus Anson, these false trails, there is so much explosive material there. It was amazing. So yeah, I really enjoyed. I was on the trail as well. If Conan Doyle was on that trail, then I was on Conan Doyle's trail. And it was all
Brilliant.
a lot of fun. Researching.
It's such vibrant history. This I mean, it's a great age of letter writing, and people have wonderful prose styles back then. So it's all stylistically brilliant, but the setting as well is so interesting, and you manage to bring a new perspective as well of race and empire, and left with so much to wonder and ponder. But anyway, I wanted to, this really is my last question, I should say. We always say to people when we finish our little journey through the past, if you could bring one object back as a memento from the time, what would you have from 1907 in this case?
Well, it is 1907, but it's probably earlier. It's when the trial happens, 1903, when the arrest happens. It's George Edalji's coat that is produced as evidence. And this coat, when it leaves the vicarage, is just damp because obviously he's been wearing it. And it had been an evening, which was a sort of wet evening. But when it did, the police say there are horsehairs on it. And the vicar looks at it and said, it's not a horsehair. Then he goes to the window and he says, there's no horsehair. It's a thread. The police keep saying it's a horsehair. Anyway, coat is taken away to the police station. And then by the time of the trial, this coat comes and the doctor declares that there are 29 horsehairs on it. So where did these mysterious horsehairs come from? And this is produced as evidence that, convicts poor George Edalji. So I'd love to see that coat with the horsehairs.
Yeah, well, it'd be a good thing to wear to the book launch, wouldn't it, maybe?
Really
interesting
doubty. Maybe nobody'd want to come near me, but keep it as,
if we're allowed book launches, if we're allowed. Who knows? Well, listen, this has been loads of fun, and I think I've learned quite a bit talking to you. Even you've taught me a bit about Staffordshire, which is nice as well. So good luck with the book. It's really, really worthwhile. I think the sense of you on the trail is abundant throughout, and it really rips along. So it's a great pacey read as well. Wow. Congratulations and thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been lovely to chat. Thank you.
That was me, Peter Moore, talking to Shrabani Basu about her engrossing new book, The Mystery of the Parsee Lawyer, Arthur Conan Doyle, George Edalji and the Case of the Foreigner in the English Village. It's recently published in hardback by Bloomsbury. As I said at the start of this episode, we have a newly released hardback copy of the book to give away to a lucky listener. To enter the draw, all you have to do is like our Facebook page. All details in the show notes. As ever, there's so much more, including a colourised image of a very cheerful Arthur Conan Doyle on our website, tttpodcast.com. I'm going to be back next week with the brilliant novelist Simon Scarrow, but from me for now, that's it. Thank you very much for listening.